Hello, and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and in this episode we do Japan during World War I and the 1920s. Japan is one of the winners of World War I, even though it is the least of the great powers. Okay, maybe in 1915 it's better than Italy. You could argue that, but in terms of gross domestic product, in terms of industrialization, in terms of many quantifiers of power, Japan is relatively small. What did it do during the First World War? Well, it was allied with Britain. They had an alliance going back to the early 20th century, and so they gobbled up the German possessions in the Pacific Islands. And a couple of ports in China that the Germans had. And so again, Japan continues to kind of pick away at the independence of China. It expands its maritime power. It made money because it replaced Western trade in the Pacific. As the Europeans were murdering each other, suddenly all of the products that people needed had to be manufactured, couldn't be shipped from Europe to Asia, and so someone else had to pick it up. And the only industrialized country in East Asia were the Japanese, was Japan. And so they actually made money. Everyone else lost money except for the Americans, for the USA, and for the Japanese. So the war was good. They replaced Western trade in the Pacific and built up manufacturing for the European war effort. We'll see this again with the Korean War. 3. Having won, they gave the infamous 21 demands. 21 demands were basically we're going to take over China while no one else is looking, especially the USA. So we go back, the USA was the protector of an open China, that no one was allowed to take over China and colonize or imperialize China because it was so important to everyone's trade. And the United States, based in the Philippines, was the major guarantor of Chinese independence. Not power, but independence. And so while the USA, from 1917 through 1919 and then the peace treaty in 1920, while the USA was busy, Wilson was busy with Europe, the idea was we are going to make demands on China and effectively end China's independence. So basically, Japan gets everything it wants, and China even has to hire Japanese advisors. The point of this was because Japan needed access to Chinese, or especially Manchurian, North China, and the territory known as Manchuria, needs access to the mineral wealth, the railroads, and the ports to be able to strip China of the materials, the mineral wealth, and the economic wealth in order to industrialize Japan. That's the point of this. An economic imperialism of China in order to direct all of China's economic raw materials to Japanese industrialization. Exactly what Japan was doing in Korea. The entire economy of Korea was being redirected since 1895 towards making Japan richer. This made China mad and is one of the biggest explosions in Chinese nationalism. Now, Chinese nationalism goes, of course, way back, but it was sparked in both the Taiping and especially in the Boxer rebellions against the emperors, kick out the foreigners, kick out the Westerners. Now it's not the Westerners, it's not the white people destroying China. They're not great, but now it's fellow East Asians, it's the Japanese. Who, let's face it, China never got along with because of Japanese pirates. Remember, always back to Japanese pirates. And so this stokes Chinese nationalism. You know, we have to save China. We have to save China from Japan. And so that's going to be the situation going into the 1920s. Japan is the strongest country in East Asia. It's the only industrializing power in East Asia. It has taken over Korea and has redirected the Korean economy towards making Japan rich, and it's enslaved the Koreans. And in the early 1920s, it's trying to destroy Korean culture. And it has started with the 21 Demands to do the same to China, while Britain, France, and the United States are all occupied in Europe with the end of the First World War. So what about Japan in the 1920s? Well, we have huge inequality still. Japan is still poor, but industrialization is allowing a small class of people to get fabulously wealthy. And there's a small middle class based on the military. That's tied to the wealthy classes. But you're still talking a small percentage of people. The ordinary Japanese person was a peasant living in the countryside, living on subsistence farming, barely getting by. Cities were developing. That's true. Trade was increasing, but it wasn't very deep. Remember, Japan has only come, the Meiji Restoration is only in the 1860s. Then there's the brief Civil War. And so Japan has kind of gone full steam ahead, but we're talking maybe 60 years at this point. Whereas Britain had had roughly 500 years of modern development. France had even longer of being a major country with a powerful king. But you could go back to the 1660s with Louis XIV and kind of the France as the dominant country. Along with Japan, we're talking Germany and Italy. And Germany was different because it was so fabulously, it was the center of Europe. It was populous. It was built up. It was urban. It had all of those pieces. They just weren't connected. So Japan looks like Italy. It's doing better. It's more organized. It's more efficient. Its government is more monodirectional. But at the same time, the economy is still wide but shallow. 2, you have Westernization. The Japanese are becoming Europeans or Americans. In the cities, not in the countryside. In the countryside, there's still, might as well be 1700. There might be more education, but in terms of culture, it's still a folk culture. It's still a people's culture, a rural people's culture. Whereas in the cities, Tokyo, Nagasaki, you are getting a class of people with wealth who are taking on our European and American cultural aesthetics, education, philosophy, industrialization. Take a look at the pictures. If you're watching the video, take a look at the pictures. You have 3 women in very Western, up-to-date European bathing suits. You have basically Pride and Prejudice. The next picture over is a mother and her 3 daughters. They could be English, if not for the women being Japanese, but they clearly could be in England or America. A wealthy upper middle class family, the women of the family, they could be American, they could be British at the turn of the century in the 1910s. Our bottom photo has a family where you could see the differences. The grandmother and the mother are in traditional Japanese rural dress, but the children are in a British sailor suit and Western feminine attire with pearls. And so you're seeing in the pictures this kind of Japan of the 1920s. Different peoples, different classes are taking on the aesthetics of Europeans. Unlike in Japan of the 1500s, right? Or in China in the Boxer Rebellion, or in Korea, trying to reject, trying to get out, get rid of Europeans. Instead, the Japanese are accepting European cultures, European styles. 3, Japan in the 1920s is getting more democracy. Hey, the democracies won, right? France, England, the United States, they won. The kingdoms, the empires of Austria, Hungary, of Russia, of Germany, they all lost. And so if you're Westernizing, democracy looks like it's winning in the early 1920s. Britain is rich. France is France. France is, if it's not, it's one of the richest countries. It's the 2nd largest empire in the world. But it's also France. It's still got the leading culture, perhaps, in the world. In terms of writers, in terms of philosophy. You know, it's the French are French. The United States is clearly the richest country in the world, the biggest industrial power. And the argument in 1920 is that's because of democracy. So what you get is the Taisho democracy period. A expansion of rights to people. More people get to vote. We're not quite, I don't believe, at universal. Every person can vote. Every man can vote. But it's a liberalization. More and more people are getting involved. More and more people are opening up. There are more and more parties trying to get more and more votes. But there's recession and economic problems. They are very tied to trade with the West, especially with trade with the USA. Makes sense. The United States was the first Western country to show up in the 1850s. It's the largest industrial power. And so when things go bad in the 1923, and then especially after 1929, things get really bad in Japan. Number 5 is a second reason why Japan and the Japanese are going to be upset with the United States. The United States passes its basic end of immigration for Japanese citizens in 1924. Then the Immigration Acts of 1924 curtailed a lot of immigration. This was the America First idea. This is basically white people, but when they meant white people immigrating, they meant Norwegians. They meant British. They didn't even want Italians coming in, much less Jews from Eastern Europe. And if they didn't want Italians and Jews, they really did not want Japanese or Chinese. And so in 1924, the USA effectively ends immigration. Now, one of the problems with that is you have a large number of Japanese immigrants, students, who have come to the United States, especially in Hawaii, who are now separated, who are now broken up, who now can't bring their families with them. Right? These are people who wanted to be part of the American immigration, part of the American economy, part of the American education system. And now, even if they can continue, their families can't. And for many of them, they can't either. They can't stay. It's not quite the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it's not very far away from it. And this is going to cause a lot of anger because of the separation of families. So this is the second reason. So we can see in Japan in the 1920s is looking at the USA with a kind of WTF attitude. You know, the USA gets an economic cold, gets sniffles. Japan catches the flu. Right? The USA decides to be really racist and anti-immigrant and America first, and it hurts Japanese industrialization, culture, education, and hurts a lot of people individually. So, there's that. 6, we see the rise of anti-communism in Japan. This is an anti-Russian, anti-Soviet Union. This Russian Revolution starts in 1917. Then there's a civil war. Stalin wins. Eventually, it's very bloody in 1922 and then dies in 1924. But there is a couple of things. One is anti-communism is about equality, which doesn't work when you have huge inequality in Japan. You don't want the peasants suddenly demanding equality. 2, there is a Communist Party developing in China that's talking Chinese nationalism. Kick out the Japanese. So there's that. 3, there's the rebuilding, especially under Stalin, of a far east Soviet presence, Soviet military presence. So if you're the Japanese, you look at communism as a problem on several fronts. One is it's a foreign policy military problem with Russia. 2 is it's a foreign policy economic problem in China. Remember the trying to redirect Chinese economics to colonize China, to imperialize China, so that China's economy is funneled into Japan. Well, if the Communist Party wants to kick you out, that's bad. And then 3, so we have 2 foreign policies, and then we have a domestic policy problem. And the domestic policy is, what if Japanese peasants start demanding equality? That the rich don't be so rich. And so there's a series of anti-communism laws. And you get increased militarism in public spaces. Increasingly, the Army and the Navy become symbols of patriotism. Lots of flags, military parades. This is what happens in the United States. This is what happens in Germany and Italy. In Germany will be later, but in the 20s, it's Italy. That increasingly patriotism is tied to military power. And you take the two together and you wrap it up into another social anti-communism system, and you end up with fascism. Those become the ingredients of fascism. So the Japanese aren't there yet in the 20s because they've still got more democracy going on, but that democracy is also very anti-communist. And so the leaders are trying to make sure the people don't go communist, but going the other way. So they're emphasizing the Japaneseness, the military victories. And that's not fascism. But you can start to see fascism from there, is the point. 7. You also have modernist art a modernist film being created, but also being ingested. Baseball as well becomes big in Japan. Whereas baseball becomes big nowhere else. American baseball is a failure to export. But in Japan, because it's tied to the United States, because it's tied to that trade, because it's tied to American power, the Japanese will pick up baseball. But likewise, they pick up modernist art, modernist film, and start producing their own. And so their style is Western. It's not Eastern. It is, they take over, they leave many of the Eastern identifiable marks behind and take on lots of Western coverage. But it lacks the post-war depression. See, if you read your Hemingway, if you read All Quiet on the Western Front, if you read a lot of the books, you look at the art that's coming out of what will be called by Hemingway the lost generation, there's a melancholy in the 20s. Like, even though we call it the Jazz Age and it's very happy, there's also a melancholy in a lot of the art. That is a WTF, what happened? Remember, 20 million people died. And then another 20 million people died in the Spanish flu. That happened right afterwards. And so the Japanese modern art it lacks that. It lacks that trauma because the Japanese won the First World War. It's the reason why there's a jazz age in the United States in 1921. Things are great. They won the First World War. They didn't suffer like France did, like Germany did, like Britain did. And so what you get is a small number of avant-garde, really people who are pushing the edge of art in Japan. And it's a small number because, one, huge inequality. There's not that many people who can buy this art. Two, huge inequality. There's not that many people who have access to the knowledge, the education, to the university language that would emphasize this, that you could pick this language up. And so it's small, but it's there. And that's a major point, is it's there. A small number of avant-garde artists, filmmakers, and writers. So Japan may be the weakest or the poorest of the big five powers, big six powers. But it's in the club, and it looks like them, and it acts like them. It's only European and American racism that kind of holds them off and says, you're not really part of the club. Which, of course, with the immigration laws and the recessions, is kind of like ticks the Japanese off. Makes total sense. And then 1929 happens. The stock market crash, the Great Depression, the massive tariffs that basically shut down international trade go up, and the world, capitalism effectively dies. The world effectively freezes up. And Japan has to figure out, what does it do? It doesn't have the money of the United States, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to spend its way out. It doesn't have that money. So what does it do? It doesn't have Britain's empire to dump its goods on, which didn't really work for the British, but that was the idea. Well, Japan can't act like the British either, or the French. So who does it emulate? It's a poor country with no empire, or a small empire. Well, you're not going to emulate China, because they've been weak for 100 years. You took over Korea. All the rest of East Asia is occupied by the Europeans, so they're not a model. So who's left? This is Soviet Union. That's bad, right? Because they're communist. We don't want that. the leaders of Japan don't want that. Right? They have a monarchy. They have an emperor. They don't want communism. Communism will get rid of the emperor. Communism will get rid of the hierarchy. Communism would destroy the Japanese social structure. So the conservatives do not want that. They don't have the imperial empires of Britain or France. Spain has been poor for 400 years. So who does that leave? It leaves Italy. It leaves Germany, who are both at this time investing in military power, in militarized nationalism. Something we've seen is already going on in Japan. The militarism in the public spaces. The, hey, we're the best country in East Asia. That pride. Well, now, in 1929, 1932, 1935, there is an emulation that you can pick. And that emulation is Germany and Italy. More than any other country. And that is going to be problematic for our next chapter on World War II and everybody in East Asia. The entire Pacific is going to be in trouble with what the Japanese, with what Japan as a country decides to solve its problem. The methodology of solving its economic problems of the Great Depression is going to be bad for lots of people. All right, so this finishes Japan. We're going to do the rest of East Asia in the next couple videos. So that's great. Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia. So that's pretty cool. And I will see you soon. So, and then after that, there's World War II, which is a terrible, horrible, depressing set of videos. So good luck. Be safe. Talk to you soon.